An elderly black woman walks to her car, only to be stopped by two police officers. What happens next is nothing short of shocking. The officers accuse her of stealing her own vehicle, their voices dripping with suspicion and hostility. As they demand proof of ownership, tension hangs in the air. But when they finally learn who she really is, their faces go pale, and everything changes. What led to this moment of racial injustice? Stay with us to find out. This is a story you won't forget. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell us where you are listening. Your support means everything. Grace Williams had always found solace in the rhythm of her daily life. At 67, she was a woman of routine and unwavering presence in her neighborhood. A retired nurse, Grace spent her days volunteering at the local clinic, visiting neighbors, and caring for her beloved garden. Her house, a modest brick home with a porch swing that creaked softly in the summer breeze, was her sanctuary. She'd raised her 3 children here, watched them grow into adults, and, though they had all moved on, the house still echoed with their laughter. For Grace, life had settled into a comfortable routine. Every morning, she took a walk to the corner store for her favorite coffee, exchanging warm greetings with familiar faces along the way. Everyone knew Grace, from the local shopkeepers to the kids playing in the park. She was a steady force in their lives, the kind of neighbor who always had a kind word, a helping hand, and a story to share. But what most people didn't know was that Grace had lived a life filled with challenges, ones that were often hidden beneath the surface. She'd seen the world change around her in ways that weren't always kind to people who looked like her. She'd experienced the sting of racism too many times to count subtle, insidious, and sometimes blatantly obvious. Yet, Grace had always held her head high, focusing on the good, not letting the negativity of the world weigh her down. On this particular morning, Grace was in a rush. The sun had barely risen, and she had a meeting with the community center to discuss a new wellness initiative she was volunteering for. Her car, an old but reliable sedan, was parked in the driveway, ready for the day's errands. It wasn't much, but it got her where she needed to go. She reached for her keys, her fingers brushing the cool metal of the fob. As she opened the car door and slid into the driver's seat, she noticed the unusual silence. No cars driving by, no chatter from the neighbors. It was almost too quiet. She glanced up, and that's when she saw them, 2 police officers, standing at the curb, their eyes locked on her. Grace's pulse quickened, but she didn't panic. She'd dealt with law enforcement before. She'd even helped in a few cases during her nursing days, but something about the way they were staring at her felt different. Grace adjusted her seatbelt and rolled down the window, smiling politely. "Good morning, officers. Can I help you with something?" The taller officer, a man in his 30s, approached the car with an almost mechanical stride, his eyes scanning her face with a hint of suspicion. "We need to verify something," he said curtly, without the usual pleasantries. Grace raised an eyebrow, confused but not alarmed. "About what? Is this your car?" he asked, pointing to the vehicle. "Of course, it's mine," Grace replied, her voice steady. "I've had it for years." The officer didn't budge. His eyes narrowed. "We've received a report of a stolen vehicle. Your license plate came up in our system, and it doesn't match. We need to verify that this car belongs to you." Grace's heart skipped a beat. Something was off, and she could feel the weight of the situation settling over her like a thick fog. "I'm telling you, it's mine. I have all the paperwork at home." The second officer, a younger woman with a stern face, crossed her arms and eyed Grace warily. "We're not going to ask again. Get out of the car." Grace's fingers tightened around the steering wheel, but she kept her voice even. "I've lived here for 40 years. You're welcome to check anything you need, but there's no reason for this to go any further." There it was again, that underlying tension, the subtle but unmistakable feeling that Grace Despite her decades of service, despite her reputation as a helpful neighbor, wasn't being treated the same as anyone else. As the officers continued to interrogate her, Grace could feel the familiar burn of being judged solely by the color of her skin. It wasn't the first time, and it likely wouldn't be the last. But she was tired. Tired of having to prove herself in a world that refused to see her humanity. Still, she kept her composure, not wanting to escalate things further. "Can I call someone for verification?" Grace asked, her voice calm but firm. The taller officer hesitated, his gaze flicking to his partner. "We'll give you a moment," he muttered. Grace pulled out her phone and dialed her daughter, hoping to resolve the matter quickly. As she waited for the call to connect, the officers remained just a few feet away, exchanging whispers. Her fingers tightened around the phone, a chill creeping down her spine. She didn't have to hear their words to know what they were talking about. Grace could already feel it: the judgment, the racial profiling, the biases that had followed her for a lifetime. This was more than just an innocent misunderstanding. Grace had seen it too many times before to ignore the signs. But just as she was about to speak, something unexpected happened. The officer's attitude shifted in an instant. The tall officer looked down at the phone in his hand, his expression suddenly pale. And that was when the tension in the air became suffocating. "Ma'am," he said, his voice shaking, "we need to check something." But Grace already knew. And as the world around her seemed to freeze in that moment, the question on everyone's mind lingered: who was she really? And what had they just uncovered? The minutes dragged on like hours. Grace sat in the car, her hands still gripping the wheel. The officers stood huddled together, their hushed voices blending into an unintelligible murmur. She could hear the faint buzz of her phone in the background, but she didn't look at it. She couldn't focus on anything other than the two officers, the weight of their actions pressing down on her, growing heavier by the second. The longer they took, the more Grace felt the walls of her patience begin to crack. She was tired of being the good black woman, the one who remained calm, who didn't escalate. How many times had she done that in her life? How many times had she swallowed her anger, suppressed the injustice? Today, though, something inside her snapped. It wasn't just the accusation anymore. It wasn't just the police and their condescending, almost dismissive attitude. It was the feeling that they believed she had to prove herself, that they were above reproach, that they could treat her any way they wanted simply because of her skin. The younger officer, the woman who had been standing off to the side, finally broke from the huddle. Her face was a mask of indifference, but there was something else there now: hesitation. "Mom," she called out, her voice lacking the usual authority. Grace knew the script by heart as she'd heard it all before. But she forced herself to hold eye contact, determined to not look away. "Yes," Grace responded, her voice steady, but the anger simmering underneath was impossible to ignore now. "We've just confirmed that the car is yours." There was a mix-up in the system, the officer said, her tone unconvincing. "But we still need to run a few more checks." The word mix-up burned through Grace. A mix-up? After everything? After the way they'd approached her? After the accusation of stealing her own car? A mix-up? The disbelief was suffocating, but it wasn't the officer's words that struck the hardest. It was the implied dismissal. The suggestion that it was all somehow an afterthought. The dehumanization in it. The act of forcing her to play by their rules. "Not good enough," Grace said, cutting through the officer's words with a sharpness that surprised even herself. "What do you mean?" the officer asked, visibly taken aback by the force in Grace's voice. Grace's breath was shallow now, her chest tightening with each word. "You've done your checks, right? You know this is my car." She paused, her voice growing stronger. "I want an apology. Not for me, but for the next person. For the next person you stop because they look like me. For the next person who's treated like a criminal before they even open their mouth." That is the issue here. Not some damn mix-up. The officer blinked, clearly flustered by the sudden intensity. Grace could feel the heat rising inside her, but she held onto the anger. She wasn't angry for herself anymore. No, she was angry for the years, for the countless people who had to endure this. For those who were silenced, for those who had to accept the dehumanizing treatment because they didn't have the platform, the voice, the presence to fight back. She didn't wait for a response. She turned her head, glancing back to the other officer. He was watching her now, his eyes darting between her and his partner, clearly struggling with the situation. The power shift was palpable. "What's your name?" Grace demanded. The officer hesitated, then shot her a cold glance. "Officer Harris. Officer Harris," she repeated, her voice now a mix of defiance and command. "You better remember this moment, because if you don't stand for what's right when it's in front of you, you have no right to call yourself a good cop. You don't get to hide behind your badge when people like me are treated like criminals for no reason other than how we look." Asterisk. The officer's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Grace thought he might argue. But then, the younger officer stepped in, her voice quieter, almost apologetic. "Ma'am, we're sorry. This shouldn't have happened. We've double-checked everything, and we understand now. This is over." It felt like a hollow victory. The apology was empty not because the words were wrong, but because Grace knew it was a one-time thing. It would be swept under the rug. She wouldn't be the first person to endure something like this, nor would she be the last. Still, she had made them pause. She had forced them to confront their own biases, even if just for a moment. But as Grace stared at the two officers, a sinking feeling took hold of her. She had won the battle, but was it enough? They had apologized, yes. But what did that apology really mean? Was it an acknowledgement of their mistake, or just an attempt to diffuse the tension? Grace wasn't sure. She wouldn't trust their words anymore. Not after everything. Asterisk. The officers stood motionless as Grace sat in her car, the engine still running, the soft hum of the vehicle the only sound cutting through the otherwise silent tension. Grace's hands remained steady on the steering wheel, but her mind was in turmoil. The apology from the officers felt insufficient, like a band-aid on a wound too deep to heal with words. It wasn't just about this incident. It was about everything that came before it. Every small act of racism she had ever endured, every time she had been treated as less than, as invisible, as guilty without reason. The younger officer, Officer Thompson, fumbled with her notepad, nervously checking her phone as if the whole situation had suddenly become something she didn't know how to handle. Officer Harris, the taller officer, stood still, staring at the ground, clearly rattled by the confrontation. But that's when Grace saw it, the subtle shift. Officer Harris wasn't just standing there because he was lost in thought. He was waiting for something. And in that moment, Grace knew exactly what was happening. A realization hit her. This was a moment that could change everything. Not just for her, but for everyone. Officer Harris was now aware. He was beginning to understand what he had done. He cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Ma'am, I think we've made a mistake here, but I'd like to suggest that we handle this in a way that doesn't escalate further." For a moment, Grace considered his words. Should she let it go, accept the apology, and drive off, letting the system continue to perpetuate its flaws in silence? No, she knew she couldn't. This wasn't just about her. It was about every black person who had been treated unjustly by a system that wasn't designed for their protection but for their subjugation. She wasn't going to let this slide. Not again. Handle this. Grace's voice was low, but fierce. "What are you really asking me to do? You want me to just accept that you've wasted my time, that you've treated me like a criminal when I've done nothing wrong? No, this isn't just a mistake. This is a pattern." She could see Officer Harris visibly tense. He wasn't used to being challenged, Not like this, not by someone who wasn't afraid to stand up to him. His partner, Officer Thompson, looked between them, her face a mask of confusion mixed with guilt. They had assumed Grace would back down, comply, say thank you, and move on, like so many others had before her. But Grace wasn't like the others. Grace wasn't going to pretend this was over just because they said it was. No, Grace continued, her voice louder now, strong. You've been out here for nearly an hour accusing me of something I didn't do. You've seen my car. You've confirmed it's mine. But what about the system? What about the fact that if I wasn't the woman I am, this could have gone so much worse? You know it. I know it. The two officers stood there, almost paralyzed, clearly taken aback by her words. The shift in the air was palpable. For the first time in this entire interaction, the officers weren't the ones in control. Grace was. Grace had never been one to back down when something was wrong, but standing up in the face of institutionalized racism felt different. It wasn't just about this car or this moment. It was about breaking the cycle, making them see the humanity in her and everyone who looked like her, and making them realize the harm they perpetuated. She leaned forward, narrowing her eyes as she looked at Officer Harris. You need to understand that what happened here isn't just some innocent mistake. It's part of a bigger problem, one you and I both know won't just disappear. I want you to think about the next person you stop. I want you to think about them before you assume they're guilty. I want you to question why you act the way you do. And I want you to take that responsibility seriously, because I won't be the last person you accuse. There was silence, then the sound of the officers shifting uneasily. The tension in the air seemed to snap as Officer Harris let out a long, resigned breath. You're right, he said, his voice quieter now, the defensiveness from earlier completely gone. I didn't think about it like that. I'm sorry for what happened. Grace didn't respond immediately. She stared at him, waiting for him to truly understand. She needed him to internalize this moment, to feel it as deeply as she did. Then, just when it seemed like the weight of the situation had fully sunk in, Grace turned to Officer Thompson, who had been silent throughout the exchange. And you, Grace said, her gaze shifting to the younger officer. What about you? What do you think? Do you think this was just a mix-up? Officer Thompson opened her mouth to speak, but closed it again, hesitating. She seemed genuinely torn, conflicted. Her hand ran nervously through her hair before she finally looked at Grace. I don't know. I was just doing my job. But after hearing you, I understand how wrong it all was. Grace nodded slowly. It's not enough to just do your job. You have to do what's right. And right now, this system, it's broken. And we need to fix it. The two officers stood there, the weight of Grace's words hanging heavily in the air. For a moment, Grace thought they might say something more and perhaps apologize again, perhaps deflect. But they said nothing. They simply stood there, perhaps processing the reality they hadn't wanted to face. Grace took a deep breath and opened her car door. The officers didn't stop her. She wasn't angry anymore. Instead, she felt a sense of quiet resolve. She wasn't done, but for now, she had made her point. Weeks passed, but the impact of that day lingered. Grace didn't just go back to her normal life. She couldn't, not after what had happened. She filed a formal complaint not for herself, but for everyone who had been treated the same way by the police system. She filed it with a lawyer, ensuring that the injustice wouldn't just be swept under the rug. She didn't expect instant change, but she knew the process had to begin somewhere. Her story spread quickly, shared by neighbors and friends. Soon, the community rallied behind her, organizing town hall meetings, speaking out about the systemic racism that had been ingrained in the very institutions meant to protect them. It became a catalyst for larger conversations that started in Grace's own neighborhood and spread across the town. People were no longer content to stand by in silence. And then came the letter. Weeks later, the local police department sent an official apology, acknowledging that their treatment of Grace was wrong. They had begun implementing new training for officers, emphasizing the importance of cultural sensitivity and racial bias awareness. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. But Grace knew that this wasn't just about one apology or one department. It was about the larger fight for justice, the continued struggle for equality. The truth was that racism wasn't something that could be fixed by a single encounter. It was a system that needed to be broken down. Piece by piece, Grace had won a small battle, but she was aware of the long road ahead. She wasn't finished yet, not by a long shot. Every small step, every conversation, every moment of courage added to the collective force needed to break the chains of racial injustice. As she sat on her porch, sipping her coffee on a quiet morning, she reflected on the journey. She had fought for her dignity. She had made her voice heard. And while the world around her hadn't changed overnight, she knew something powerful had shifted within her and within her community. Her story wasn't just hers. It was a story shared by so many others. And as long as she had breath in her body, Grace would continue to fight for those who had no voice, for those who needed a reminder that they were worthy of respect, of dignity, of justice. The fight for change was far from over. But Grace Williams was no longer a silent observer. She was a force. And that, in itself, was enough to make a difference. The fight isn't over. It never ends. But the human spirit is resilient. And sometimes, that's enough to change the world.